Rome lasted over 1,000 years. The British Empire ruled a quarter of the world. The Mongols conquered more land than any civilization in history, and yet every single one of them collapsed. Every single one. Here's what's terrifying: they all fell the same way. The pattern of collapse has repeated for 5,000 years. Historians have documented it. Economists have studied it. And right now, you're living through it. The signs are everywhere: economic instability, political division, declining trust in institutions. History repeats itself, but here's the real question. Why do the most powerful civilizations in history fail to see their own destruction coming? Today, we're going to decode the pattern that nobody talks about. 10 stages of imperial collapse, each one more disturbing than the last. And by the end, you'll understand exactly where we stand today. The hubris phase. Every empire begins its decline the same way, with absolute certainty that decline is impossible. The Romans called it superbia, the pride that comes before the fall. When an empire reaches its peak, something dangerous happens in the collective consciousness. Success becomes identity, power becomes entitlement, and the very strengths that built the empire transform into weaknesses. Consider Rome at its height under Trajan. The empire stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia. Roman citizens genuinely believed their civilization was eternal. Rome will last forever, for the gods have willed it. This wasn't just poetry, it was policy. The Romans stopped adapting because they believed adaptation was beneath them. They had one history, why change what works? But here's what the Romans couldn't see. The world was changing around them. New threats were emerging. New technologies were developing, and Rome, frozen in its own magnificence, was becoming a monument to the past. The British made the same mistake. At Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in 1897, the empire controlled 458 million people across every continent. Invincible, unstoppable, eternal. 50 years later, it was gone. The pattern is clear. Empires die when they believe they cannot die. But hubris is just the beginning. Economic decay. Behind every falling empire, there's a hidden rot, the corruption of money itself. Rome didn't fall to barbarians. Rome fell to inflation. In the year 200 AD, the Roman denarius contained 95% silver. By 270 AD, less than 5%. Worthless. The emperors discovered a dark temptation. They could pay their debts by debasing the currency. Soldiers needed wages, print more coins. Building projects needed funding, dilute the silver. It seemed like magic, but there's no such thing as free money. As the currency collapsed, so did trust in Roman institutions. Merchants started refusing denarii. Trade networks broke down. Soldiers demanded payment in grain and goods instead of worthless coins. The economy didn't crash overnight. It slowly suffocated over generations. Inflation is the silent assassin of great civilizations. Spain made the same mistake after conquering the Americas. They flooded Europe with so much gold and silver that their own currency became worthless. The Dutch, the French, the Weimar Republic, every empire that tried to print its way to prosperity discovered the same horrifying truth. There is no means of avoiding the final collapse of a boom brought about by credit expansion. When the money dies, the empire follows. But economic decay creates something even more dangerous: class warfare. When the economy weakens, the social fabric tears. And what emerges is the oldest conflict in human history, the war between those who have and those who have not. In late Rome, the wealth gap became obscene. Senators owned estates larger than some countries. Meanwhile, Roman citizens were selling themselves into slavery just to survive. The middle class, the backbone of Roman prosperity, simply vanished, eaten alive by taxes, inflation, and desperation. The philosopher Salvian, writing as Rome crumbled, documented something chilling. Poor Romans were actually fleeing to live among the barbarians. Let that sink in. Citizens of the greatest civilization on earth preferred life among the so-called savages because at least the barbarians didn't tax them into oblivion. Rich, richer, poor, poorer. This pattern repeats everywhere. Before the French Revolution, The aristocracy controlled 90% of France's wealth while peasants starved. Before the Russian Revolution, the Romanovs lived in unimaginable luxury while workers froze in slums. When the people shall have nothing more to eat, they will eat the rich. Economic inequality doesn't just cause suffering, it breeds revolutionary rage. And once that rage ignites, it burns everything. But there's a symptom that appears even before the flames: political chaos. Healthy empires have functioning politics. Dying empires have political theater. In the 50 years between 235 and 285 AD, Rome had over 25 emperors. Most were murdered. Some lasted only weeks. The Senate became a joke. Power wasn't won through debate or merit. It was seized by whoever commanded the most loyal soldiers. Politics became a blood sport with no rules and no winners. Sound familiar? The signs of political decay are always the same. Compromise becomes impossible. Each faction sees the other not as opponents but as enemies. Winning becomes more important than governing. The common good, nobody even remembers what that means. During the fall of the Roman Republic, Julius Caesar and Pompey didn't just disagree on policy. They raised armies against each other. Civil war became the new normal. Enemies everywhere, trust nowhere. The Byzantine Empire suffered the same fate. The Nika riots of 532 AD started as a dispute between chariot racing factions, basically sports teams. It ended with half of Constantinople in flames and 30,000 people dead. A house divided against itself cannot stand. When politics becomes warfare, governance becomes impossible. And when governance fails, what fills the vacuum? Something far more dangerous: military decline. Empires are built by warriors. They die when warriors become mercenaries. At its peak, the Roman army was the most disciplined fighting force the world had ever seen. Roman soldiers weren't just warriors, they were engineers, builders, administrators. They believed in Rome. They would die for Rome. Loyalty. But as the empire decayed, something changed. Roman citizens no longer wanted to serve. Military service was dangerous, poorly paid, and took you away from home for decades. So Rome made a fateful decision. They started hiring barbarians. By the 4th century, entire Roman legions were composed of Germanic warriors who had no connection to Roman values, Roman culture, or Roman identity. They fought for gold, not glory. The protectors became the predators. In 410 AD, when Alaric the Visigoth sacked Rome, many of his soldiers had previously served in the Roman army. They knew every weakness, every entry point, every secret. An army of mercenaries will always be a danger to the state. The British Empire made the same mistake, relying increasingly on colonial troops while British citizens grew soft at home. Outsourced power, forgotten duty. When a civilization stops defending itself, it has already decided to die. But military decline is just a symptom of something deeper: moral collapse. Every dying empire experiences something its founders would find unrecognizable: the complete inversion of values. The Romans who built the Republic valued gravitas, dignity, duty, self-control. The Romans who watched it burn valued spectacle, pleasure, and immediate gratification. The Colosseum didn't exist during Rome's rise. It was built during its decline. Think about that. A civilization that entertains itself to death is already dead. By the late empire, Roman citizens spent their days watching blood sports, consuming free grain, and demanding ever more spectacular diversions. Work was for slaves. Sacrifice was for fools. The pursuit of pleasure became the only remaining philosophy. Bread and circuses. But here's what nobody wants to admit: moral collapse isn't about individual sin. It's about institutional rot. When the systems that reward virtue and punish vice break down, people simply adapt to the new reality. The measure of a man is what he does with power. And when power corrupts absolutely, virtue becomes a liability. The honest are exploited. The ruthless thrive. Until eventually no one can even remember what honor meant. The scales of justice become garbage. And once that happens, there's no going back. Only forward into something even darker: loss of identity. What does it mean to be Roman? At the empire's peak, every citizen knew the answer. By its end, no one did. Identity is the invisible glue that holds civilizations together. Shared stories, common values, a sense of belonging to something larger than yourself. When that glue dissolves, everything falls apart. A people without the knowledge of their past history is like a tree without roots. Late Rome was a civilization that had forgotten why it existed. The old gods were mocked. The new religion was still finding its footing. Traditional Roman virtues seemed quaint, outdated, irrelevant. There was nothing left to believe in except personal survival. Who are we? Why are we here? Does any of this matter? This isn't just ancient history. The Soviet Union collapsed in part because nobody believed in communism anymore, not even the communists. The ideology that once inspired millions became an empty ritual, a performance nobody took seriously. Empty words, hollow beliefs. When a civilization loses its story, it loses its will to survive. People will fight for meaning even more than they fight for survival. Without purpose, there's nothing worth defending. And without anything worth defending, the barbarians at the gate start to look less like enemies and more like liberators. Speaking of which, external pressure. Empires rarely fall to external enemies alone. They fall because internal weakness invites external attack. The Huns didn't suddenly become dangerous in the 4th century. They had always been there, just beyond the frontier. What changed was Rome's ability to resist them. Weakness invites aggression. When word spread that Roman legions were unreliable, that Roman defenses were crumbling, that Roman cities were ripe for plunder, every tribe on the border took notice. The pattern is universal. The Mongols conquered China not during its strength, but during the chaos of the Song-Jin Wars. The Spanish conquered the Aztecs when the empire was already weakened by smallpox and internal rebellion. In war, the way is to avoid what is strong and strike at what is weak. Predators smell weakness, and falling empires radiate weakness like a dying animal radiates heat. Vulnerable, but here's the cruel irony. External pressure often accelerates internal decay. Resources get diverted to defense. Civil liberties get restricted in the name of security. Fear replaces reason. The empire becomes what it was fighting against. The walls get higher. The paranoia grows deeper. And inside those walls, the real collapse continues unchecked. But what happens when those walls finally break? The final stage. The end, when it comes, is always both sudden and gradual. Gradual because the decay takes generations. Sudden because the final collapse happens in months. In 476 AD, the last Roman emperor in the West, a teenager named Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer. There was no great battle, no dramatic last stand. The empire simply stopped. One day it existed, the next day it didn't. The population of Rome had already collapsed from over 1 million to perhaps 50,000. The aqueducts were broken. The roads were crumbling. The great forums where senators once debated were now cattle pastures. This is the way the world ends. Not with a bang, but a whimper. What's haunting is how normal it all seemed to the people living through it. They didn't experience a dramatic apocalypse. They experienced a slow degradation of everything they once took for granted. Fewer services, less security, lower quality. Year after year, generation after generation, until people forgot that things had ever been different. Slow decay, invisible death. And yet, even in destruction, there's a seed of hope. The rebirth code. Here's what historians don't emphasize enough. Empires fall, but humanity continues. And sometimes, what rises from the ashes is greater than what came before. The fall of Rome was catastrophic, but it also created space for new civilizations to emerge. The chaos of the Dark Ages eventually gave birth to the Renaissance. From the ashes came Michelangelo, Leonardo, Galileo. Every ending contains within it the seeds of a new beginning. The pattern of collapse is terrifying, but it's not destiny. The Stoic philosophers understood this. Marcus Aurelius, who ruled Rome at the peak of its challenges, left us a manual for surviving impossible times. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. We cannot control the fate of empires, but we can control how we respond. We can choose to cultivate virtue in an age of vice, to seek wisdom in an age of foolishness, to build genuine connections in an age of isolation. Prepare, adapt, survive, thrive. The pattern nobody sees isn't just a pattern of destruction. It's also a pattern of renewal. The darkest night eventually gives way to dawn. The question is, will you be ready when the sun rises? Every empire in history has followed the same path. Hubris, economic decay, class warfare, political chaos, military decline, moral collapse, loss of identity, external pressure, and finally, the fall. Pattern revealed, truth spoken. But you now know something most people never learn. You've seen behind the curtain. You understand that collapse isn't random, it's predictable. And that which is predictable can be prepared for. The Stoics survived the fall of Rome. The scholars preserved knowledge through the Dark Ages. The builders eventually created the Renaissance. The truth is never comfortable, but it's always worth knowing. The pattern nobody sees is no longer hidden from you. What you do with this knowledge, that's entirely your choice. History has more to teach us. Subscribe if you want to learn.